It's the week before Mara left Thornfield, and one small request she made that nobody in that building thought twice about. That request is the entire story.
The coffee went cold while I was still deciding whether to drink it. That was the morning after. The morning I stood in the kitchen of the house that still had both our names on the deed, still had the smell of the kitchen I had designed, cedar and old paper, and the particular warmth of a house that had been lived in seriously, and understood in the specific way you understand things when your body knows before your mind catches up that I was going to have to be very, very deliberate about what happened next. Dorian had left already. He always left early. That had been true for 11 years, since before we married, since back when I had read his early mornings as evidence of a serious and admirable ambition. Now I knew they just meant he was somewhere I wasn't. I set the mug down and looked at the calendar on the wall. Oh, the date was circled in blue. My handwriting. I had drawn that circle 6 weeks ago, when the board meeting had meant something else entirely. When I had been preparing to present the Q3 compliance review I had spent 4 months building, the review that would take Thornfield Advisory through the most complex regulatory period it had faced since the 2016 restructuring. Instead, I had walked into that room and been asked to step aside. They don't say it that way when they're doing it. Nobody says it that way. They said, restructuring. They said, new direction. Dorian said, from the far side of the mahogany table, his hands flat on its surface, that the board felt a transition of leadership in financial reporting would better position Thornfield for the coming year. He said it the way he had been practicing it, measured, even impersonal, like a man reading from a prepared statement, which, I understood later, was exactly what he was doing. He could not look at me. The board members sat in a row along one side. Some of them had worked with me for 6 years. 2 of them had shaken my hand at my wedding. They studied their folders or the middle distance or the wood grain of the table. Not one of them looked at me. Lavinia was not in the room. That was deliberate. Dorian had managed it carefully, keeping her absence clean so that no one could point to a direct conflict of interest. But her absence was so precisely engineered that it was almost a presence. 3 weeks earlier, she had been given a desk on the 4th floor. 2 weeks before that, her name had begun appearing in emails I had always originated. Subtle things. Accumulating things. How would I had been understanding it before the meeting? I am not going to pretend otherwise. But understanding a thing and having it confirmed in a boardroom by your husband from a prepared statement are 2 different experiences. One is a slow cold seeping. The other is a tap shutting off. I didn't speak for a long time, long enough that one of the board members shifted in his seat and the papers in his folder rustled in the silence. Then I said, "What's the timeline?" Not a question. I already knew it would be fast. "We'd like the transition completed by end of month," Dorian said. 23 days. "Fine," I said. That was the entire negotiation. That was the conversation in which 6 years of 70-hour weeks was resolved. I left the building that evening with my bag over my shoulder, and I didn't stop for anyone. Oh, and I took the elevator down instead of the stairs, which I always took. The elevator gave me 23 seconds of alone before the lobby. I watched the floor numbers descend. 23 seconds was enough to decide what I was going to do. I had come to Thornfield before it was called Thornfield. The firm had been Wyndham Capital Partners when I joined as a senior analyst 9 years ago at 31. It was a small operation then, 12 people, 2 institutional clients, and a compliance framework that existed mainly as a collection of loosely organized spreadsheets maintained by a part-time consultant who worked remotely on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The consultant was thorough and well-intentioned and had built something that functioned adequately for the size the firm had been. The firm was no longer that size. And I rebuilt the framework from the inside out. That is not an embellishment. The compliance architecture that Thornfield had operated on for the last 6 years, the reconciliation methodology that passed its first major regulatory review in my 3rd year, the reporting structure that had allowed the firm to take on 4 additional institutional clients without triggering oversight complications, the reserve calculation logic that the external auditors had never once flagged, that was mine. I had designed it. I had built it. I had spent 3 years iterating it and another 3 years training the people around me to work within it. I called it the Integrated Reporting and Reconciliation Protocol. My team called it the RRP. Oh, the auditors from the Financial Compliance Authority had referenced it specifically in their last review as an unusually robust internal framework representing a meaningful elevation of industry standard practice at the mid-size advisory firm level. I still had that letter. I had always kept that letter. What I had also always kept, and this is the part that would matter, was my original employment contract, the one I had negotiated when I was 31, and newly enough arrived that Wyndham's then CEO had underestimated me across the table. He had been polite about it. Polite underestimation is still underestimation. There was a clause in that contract. Clause 14, subsection 3b. It stated that any methodology, framework, or operational system developed independently of existing firm intellectual property, all documented as original work by the named employee and implemented firm-wide following a demonstrable development period, would remain the intellectual property of the named employee, licensed to the firm for use during the term of employment. Upon separation from the firm, for any reason whatsoever, those IP rights reverted fully to the named employee unless a separate assignment agreement had been executed, negotiated in good faith, and compensated at assessed fair market value. Dorian had been at the table when I signed that contract. He had been a junior partner then, not yet managing partner, not yet the man who would sit across a boardroom 9 years later reading from a prepared statement. He had not paid close attention to Clause 14.3b. I had always paid attention to Clause 14.3b. I had thought about it occasionally over the years, the way you sometimes revisit a good early decision. Not because I anticipated needing it, because it was precise and correct, and there is a private satisfaction in precision. Now I thought about it with something considerably sharper than satisfaction. The next morning I came in at 7. The building smelled exactly as it always had. Recycled air and the industrial neutrality of commercial carpet cleaner. The specific olfactory blankness that had greeted me 9 years ago when I first walked in as a candidate and had become as unremarkable as breathing. The lobby guard looked up when I came through the revolving door and looked back down at his desk. Because I came through every morning at 7 and there was nothing notable in it, I took the elevator to the 4th floor. Past the open-plan desks, past the glass-walled meeting rooms. I took the long route to my office because the long route passed the desk that had been assigned to Lavinia 3 weeks ago. She was not in yet. Her desk had a small potted succulent on it that had not been there the week before. A claiming thing. A quiet, incremental claiming. I went to my office and sat at my desk. I opened the external hard drive. The personal one, which had lived in my bag and been plugged into my workstation every morning for 6 years. It was a working practice I had maintained from my first year, keeping my working files and personal documentation separate from the firm's shared server. The IT department had noted it once in my second year, and the then head of operations had signed off on it as standard analyst working practice. It's consistent with confidentiality protocols. That sign-off was in my personnel file. I created a new folder on the drive. I labeled it with the date and the word record. Then I began to document. Not frantically, not in a panic. Methodically, the way I had always worked, which was also the reason the firm had functioned the way it functioned. I made a time-stamped log of every system I had built, every decision point those systems contained, every place in the logic where a non-obvious choice had been made, and why. I identified 6 places in the annual reconciliation cycle where my understanding of the firm's historical client relationships informed a judgment call that was not written into any procedure manual because the procedure manual had been written before those clients existed and had never been updated to account for them. And I noted which outputs in the IRRP were formula-driven and which were judgment-driven, and I documented the basis of each judgment in precise terms. I was not sabotaging anything. I want to be absolutely clear about this because it will seem obvious from the outside, and it was obvious to me at the time, but the distinction mattered enormously. I was documenting what was real. I was creating a record of my own work in my own files. I was not altering any firm system, removing any firm data, or corrupting any process. What I was doing was making explicit, In my own documentation, the gap between what the IRRP's shared server documentation described and what the IRRP actually required to function correctly. What the shared documentation described, what the system produced, and the inputs required to produce it. Was what my personal files documented, why those inputs existed, what historical and institutional knowledge underpinned them, and what happened, specifically, when they were populated incorrectly. Without the why, you could run the system and get outputs. Acceptable outputs, even, for a while. You would simply not know when those outputs were beginning to drift. You would not know which indicators warranted attention. You would not know about the reserve calculation in Q4 that always required adjustment against the September client rollover data before entry, because entering it first and adjusting afterward created a rounding discrepancy that accumulated across the quarterly cycle and would, by the end of the fourth quarter, produce a material misstatement in the annual reserve line. I knew this because I had discovered it in year 3. He corrected it in year 4 and incorporated the correction into my personal working practice without formally documenting it in the shared system, because at the time there had been no reason to formalize it. It was mine. I understood it. I applied it every quarter without thinking about it the way you stop thinking consciously about how to drive once you have driven for long enough. I documented it now, in my personal files, with a timestamp. Then I went through my personal email archive, the private account I had always CC'd on substantive professional correspondence as a practice of redundancy, a habit from my first job that I had never stopped, and organized 6 years of correspondence into a folder structure that told a coherent and precise story of what I had built, when I had built it, and how it had functioned. All of this took 5 days. I came in at 7 every morning and left at 6. I spoke to the people who spoke to me. I answered questions. I was not obstructive, not cold, not visibly altered from the person I had been the week before the board meeting. The documentation I was building was for my own protection. The information I gave to colleagues was accurate. That was important. If it came out later that I had withheld information during the transition, everything I was building would be undermined. I answered everything accurately. I simply answered the questions that were asked of me, and some of what needed to be known was not being asked. On day 6, I submitted a formal request to HR. The request was for a copy of my original employment contract, my complete personnel file including all signed documentation, and a full list of IP-related filings associated with my name in the firm's record system. The request was routed through the standard departure process, which Thornfield had formalized 3 years earlier, ironically at my recommendation, during a compliance review, and which obligated HR to fulfill within 5 business days. HR processed mine in 48 hours and sent it to my personal email, which I had specified as the delivery address. I opened the files that evening at home, at the kitchen table, with the lamps low and Dorian somewhere on the other side of the house. His presence moved through the walls as sound and light and the intermittent sound of a television program, all of it arriving to me as information about a life I was already, in the ways that counted, beginning to leave. I found clause 14.3b. Also, I found the list of IP-related filings. I found that the IRRP had been registered in the firm's internal IP tracking system under my name. This was standard at the time of filing because the procedure required the originating employee to be named, and that the firm had never taken the additional step of executing a formal IP assignment agreement with my signature. That step required my signature. My signature had never been obtained because no one had understood it was necessary. I printed the IP filing documentation. I printed clause 14.3b. I printed the FCA letter from the previous year's review, the one that had called the IRRP an unusually robust internal framework. I put them in a folder. Then I emailed Gideon. Gideon had been head of regulatory affairs at Thornfield when I joined. He was the person who had seen early on what I was building in the compliance function and had cleared whatever path needed clearing for me to build it. He had been the first person in that firm to understand what I was doing before I could fully articulate it myself. He had retired 4 years ago, settled somewhere with a vegetable garden and too many books, and called me occasionally when he read something in the financial press that reminded him of one of our old debates. He called me back within an hour of receiving my email. "Tell me," he said. I told him. I gave him the professional account, the board meeting, the IP clause, the filing, the gap in the assignment paperwork. I did not give him the marital account. It was not what I needed from him, and it was not what he was best positioned to address. He was quiet when I finished. A long moment of it. Oh, the specific quiet of someone turning something over carefully. The IP was never formally assigned, he said. Never. There's no assignment agreement anywhere in the filing record. And the IRRP is in active use. It is the active reporting framework for the firm. It is what the FCA reviewed last year and noted specifically. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, something quieter than that, something private. They are going to have a very interesting audit year, he said. The FCA review is scheduled for April, I said. Q1 and Q2 current year data. The new team will be handling their first full quarter close by then. Yes, Gideon said, simply. They will be. We did not say anything further about it. We talked for another 20 minutes about a regulatory development in a European market he had been tracking, and a change that would likely ripple to domestic advisors within 18 months. He had always been forward-looking that way, reading the direction of travel 2 cycles before anyone else noticed the movement. Before he hung up, he said, with a quietness that was different from the rest of the conversation, "You're going to be all right, Mara." "I know," I said. I meant it. On day 18, I had the most significant conversation of the transition period, and it happened in my office at 10 in the morning with Lavinia. She knocked on the open door and stood in the frame, with her laptop under one arm and an expression I recognized immediately, the look of someone who has a question they have already decided to frame as something else. She came in without being asked to and put her laptop on the edge of my desk. She was 29. She had a good MBA, 3 years at a mid-tier advisory firm, and a confident energy that I had watched Dorian respond to from the first week she appeared on the 4th floor. I had understood what that response was. I had watched it with the specific cold clarity you develop when you have been watching someone carefully for a long time and have become very good at reading what they are not saying. She was not incompetent. I want to be precise about this because the easiest version of this story, the version that requires the least thinking, is that she was terrible at the job and I was exceptional, and the contrast was dramatic and obvious. That is not the accurate version. She was genuinely capable within the range of her experience. The problem was not that she was bad at the work. I knew the problem was that she had been given a role that was 9 years deep and told she could fill it in 3 weeks of briefings and transition documents. No one 3 weeks into a 9-year role knows what they don't know yet. "The Q4 reserve model," she said, turning the laptop screen toward me. "There are 3 input parameters I can't find a formula for." I looked at the screen. The 3 parameters she was pointing to were the reserve adjustment variables I had built from 5 years of historical client data. They were not formulas in the conventional algorithmic sense. They were judgment inputs. The system called them R1, R2, Marschfeast, and the shared documentation described them only as adjusted reserve inputs based on rolling client activity data. That description was accurate in the way a map legend is accurate. It tells you what the symbol means without telling you when to use it. I walked her through the calculation methodology. I gave her the historical basis for each variable. I walked her through the September rollover adjustment, the specific timing issue, why it had to happen before entry rather than after, what the downstream consequence of inverting that sequence was. She typed. She asked good follow-up questions, the questions of someone paying attention. When she was done, she looked up from her notes and said simply, "That's not in the procedure manual." "No," I said. "It's a working practice." It had developed over time, and I applied it as part of my own process. She held my gaze for a moment. The specific calculation of someone deciding whether to say the next thing. "Should I ask you to write it up before you go?" I looked at her carefully. "You can put in a formal documentation request through HR," I said. "They can add it to the transition package before my last day." She nodded slowly. "Right, I'll do that." She took her laptop and left. I waited. Day 19, day 20, day 21. On day 22, I checked the HR intake system. I retained access to it until my final day, which was standard for departing senior staff managing their own offboarding logistics. And I checked the incoming requests filed in the last week. No documentation request from Lavinia, no request from anyone. Oh, it is possible she had convinced herself the conversation had been sufficient. It is possible she had spoken to Dorian and he had decided not to escalate it. Because escalating it would mean acknowledging, formally, that the transition was considerably more complicated than he had presented to the board. It is possible she had simply underestimated the gap, the way you underestimate a gap when you have not yet fallen through it. I did not know which. I knew only that the formal request never arrived, and I knew that the September rollover adjustment, the one that prevented the Q4 rounding discrepancy that compounded across the quarterly cycle and produced, by year's end, a material misstatement, was not recorded in any document that would remain at Thornfield after I walked out the door. On day 23, I cleared my office. And I had 2 boxes, not more. I'd always kept my office spare, a personal discipline, or maybe an instinct I had carried from somewhere early and never examined. An instinct that said, do not accumulate what you may need to leave quickly. The external hard drive went into my bag, not the boxes. My bag, where it had always been kept, where it had always lived as personal property. It had never been registered as firm equipment. It was not on any firm inventory. It was mine, and it had always been mine, and no one at Thornfield had ever thought to question this because no one had needed to. I returned my firm laptop and my access card to the office manager, who was precise and professional about it. I signed the departure documentation. I collected my final package. Then I went upstairs to the 6th floor. Dorian's assistant had been with him for 7 years. She was exceptionally good at her job, which meant she was exceptionally good at managing the space between what was happening and what was being said about what was happening. When I came off the elevator, she looked up and something moved very briefly across her face before she returned it to neutral. "He's in a call," she said. "I know. Can you let him know I've cleared out and returned my equipment?" "Of course." I handed her an envelope. She took it with both hands. The way people receive things they understand are significant without knowing why. The envelope contained a letter from the IP rights attorney I had engaged the previous week. The letter formally notified Thornfield Advisory that the Integrated Reporting and Reconciliation Protocol remained the intellectual property of the named originator, pursuant to Clause 14.3b of the employment contract dated at signing, and that continued use of the IRRP framework following the termination of employment constituted unlicensed use of proprietary intellectual property, subject to assessment and remediation. The letter invited the firm to contact the attorney's office at their earliest convenience to discuss a licensing arrangement. I went back to the elevator. I pressed the lobby button. The doors opened. I walked out through the revolving door and into the morning, which was cold and flat and bright. The particular brightness of late January light that has no warmth in it. I did not look back at the building. Oh, not as a gesture. Not because I was performing a thing. I simply did not need to see it. The days after leaving have their own texture. I had not anticipated this. I had expected the absence of work to feel like absence, a gap, a silence where something had been. Instead, it felt like the cessation of noise. I had been living inside so long, I had stopped registering it as noise. A machine switching off. The sudden, surprising quality of a room that is simply quiet. I had been at Thornfield for 9 years. 6 of those years had been spent in the mode of someone who believes a place is partly theirs. Not ownership, not equity, but something closer to authorship. The feeling of a thing you built with your own hands. Dorian sent 2 text messages and an email in the 3 days following my departure. The text messages were short and managed. The word transition appeared in both. This told me he was still in the mode of treating the professional and the personal as the same negotiation, that he had not yet understood they had separated, or he understood and was not ready to acknowledge it. The email was longer. There were places in it where the register shifted, where the formal language loosened into something closer to the person I had known for 11 years before tightening back into professional distance. He had written it more than once. I could tell by the places where the sentences didn't quite join. I did not respond to any of it. This was deliberate, but it was not performance. I had nothing to say to him yet. The conversation I needed to have with Dorian was a specific one, requiring specific timing, and the timing was not yet right. I was waiting for April. How much meanwhile? There was work. Gideon had in the week after my departure, made an introduction. Not to a financial advisory firm. He understood I was not looking for another version of what I had left, but to an organizational consulting group that worked with institutions on compliance architecture and regulatory readiness. He had described my profile and my specific expertise to their managing director, and they had called me within 36 hours. The call lasted 2 hours. We talked about the IRRP without my naming it directly, about the complexity of regulatory compliance at mid-size advisory firms, about the specific knowledge gaps that tend to appear when a firm grows faster than its internal frameworks, and the kinds of structural interventions that address them most efficiently. And at the end of the call, they asked me to come in for a formal conversation. I came in. We talked for 3 hours. The following week, they offered me a contract position, senior regulatory consultant, project-based engagement, available to begin immediately. The rate was higher than my Thornfield salary, not marginally, meaningfully. This was not something I had calculated, but it was not something I should have been surprised by. Inside a firm, your compensation reflects what the firm has normalized over years of incremental raises shaped by internal equity politics and budget cycles. From the outside, pricing a specialist is different. The market was clear about what someone with my specific profile, the IRRP, the FCA familiarity, the record of clean reviews at a growing advisory firm, was worth when priced independently. As I accepted the contract. I started 2 weeks after leaving Thornfield. The months between January and April have a particular quality in the financial advisory world. They are the months when prior year data must be finalized and current year reporting cycles begin to overlap, when the quality of a firm's internal systems is put under real operational pressure for the first time since the previous year. They are, in other words, the months when you learn what you have actually built and what you have only believed yourself to have built. I knew this. I had known it when I considered the calendar and understood that Lavinia would be handling her first full quarter close, under a methodology she had been partially briefed on, in a system whose underlying logic she did not fully possess, in the exact months that traditionally exposed the gaps. I was not waiting for her to fail. I want to be precise about this distinction because it matters to me, and because the difference between those two orientations is the difference between what I was doing and what a lesser or more reckless version of me might have done instead. What I was waiting for was information. I was waiting to understand what would happen and what they would do with what happened and whether the firm would handle it responsibly. The first indication came from a former colleague in the equity division, a senior analyst I had mentored for 2 years, someone precise and careful who understood what she was relaying. She sent a message through a personal channel in late February. It was brief. It said the Q1 reconciliation cycle was taking twice as long as it had in prior years, and that there were questions being asked on the floor, the low-frequency kind that circulate when something is not resolving cleanly and people don't know whether to escalate it. I thanked her. I filed the message in my documentation folder with the timestamp and a note. The second indication came from Gideon, who had a contact on the FCA review committee and who called me on a Thursday evening in March with the unhurried tone of someone delivering information they have already organized completely before picking up the phone. "Review confirmed for April 5th, he said. "Standard scope, full prior year review plus Q1 current. Full prior year review plus Q1 current." I checked the full prior year data. Q1 through Q4 of the previous year had been compiled under my management under the IRRP correctly. That data would review cleanly. The Q1 current year data, January through March of this year, had been compiled by Lavinia without the September rollover adjustment, without the judgment-based reserve parameters, without the institutional knowledge of why those inputs existed. That data would have an anomaly in it. I had known this with a quiet, depressing certainty since the day the formal documentation request had not arrived. "Any flags ahead of the review?" I asked. "Nothing formal yet," Gideon said. "Review teams don't typically flag until they're in the room and working through the material." "Right." He paused. "How are you, Mara?" It was a different question from the ones we had been discussing. "I'm all right," I said. Which was true. April 5th came on a Tuesday. I was at my desk in the consulting firm's office. A rented workspace, clean and neutral. a desk that was entirely mine in the sense that it had no history, when my phone rang at 2:15 in the afternoon. Unknown number, London area code. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from a partner at a compliance law firm. He identified himself precisely, gave his firm's name, and said he was calling on behalf of Thornfield Advisory regarding a matter of professional urgency. He would appreciate a return call at my earliest convenience. I listened to it twice. Then I called Gideon. "Review team found something," he said before I could ask. "My contact says there's an anomaly in the Q1 reserve calculations. Auditors flagged it as a potential material misstatement. Also, they're currently investigating whether it's a one-off input error or evidence of a systemic framework problem." I looked at the window across from my desk. The afternoon light was coming in flat and gray. "How material?" I asked. "Material enough to require a formal written response," Gideon said. "Not catastrophic in isolation, but if it's classified as systemic, the FCA will want to see a full framework review and a remediation plan. That's a significantly more involved process." "It's not systemic," I said. "It's a Q1 anomaly, a specific unapplied adjustment that I documented in my personal files 11 days before I left." Which you have. "Which I have. Time-stamped." Another pause. Gideon, when he was being careful, paused a particular way. This was that pause. "They're going to come to you," he said. "Yes," I said. "Oh, they are." The compliance law firm partner called again the next morning. I returned the call at 9:30 from my personal phone with a recording application running. He was professional and measured. He explained that Thornfield was engaged in a regulatory review and that certain questions had arisen regarding the Q1 financial reconciliation. He said the firm was aware I had been the originating architect of the IRRP framework and that they wondered whether I would be available for a consultation to assist in clarifying certain methodological questions. He used the word consultation deliberately. He was good at his job. "I'm currently engaged on a separate consulting contract," I said. "My availability would need to be negotiated on appropriate terms." "Of course," he said. "Monsieur, the firm is prepared to discuss appropriate compensation for your time." "Before we discuss compensation," I said, "I'd like to clarify one point. Are you calling on behalf of Thornfield in connection with the IP notification my attorney sent in January?" A pause. Brief and contained, but there. "That matter is part of the broader discussion the firm would like to have," he said. "Good," I said. "Then I'd like all further communications routed through my attorney." I gave him Josephine's contact details and ended the call. Josephine had been practicing intellectual property and employment law for 22 years. She was quiet-voiced and unhurried, in the specific manner of someone who has been effective for long enough that she no longer needs to perform effectiveness. Yet, when I had first called her about the IP matter in January, she had listened to the whole situation without interruption, before asking 3 very precise questions, the kind of questions that tell you immediately that someone has understood the situation completely. I briefed her on the new development that afternoon. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "You have the time-stamped documentation of the September adjustment." "Yes." "You have the IP filing that names you as originator." "Yes." "You have the FCA letter citing the IRRP by name as a robust framework." "Yes." "And there is no IP assignment agreement with your signature anywhere in the firm's records." "There is not." She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone assembling a picture. "The firm's position is interesting," she said finally. "They are currently using a framework that is technically your intellectual property, operated under a clause in your employment contract that you are no longer employed under. The framework has produced a discrepancy in its current application, not in your hands, in theirs. And the only documentation that explains why the discrepancy occurred and how to correct it is in your personal files, not in theirs." "That is the position," I said. "They will want you to return and correct it." "Yes." "The question," she said, "is what that costs them." "Yes," I said. "That is exactly the question." Josephine negotiated the initial terms with the compliance law firm over 2 days. She called me after the second day and walked me through the offer. Thornfield was proposing a 6-month consulting contract at a day rate that was generous in the conventional sense. They wanted me in an advisory capacity, working with Lavinia's team on the Q1 reconciliation, providing the documentation needed for the FCA review, and developing a formal written procedure manual for the IRRP going forward. The document that should have been formally requested and formally created during my transition and had not been. The last part was notable. They wanted me to write down what they had failed to obtain the rights to. They had also, in this first offer, entirely declined to address the IP matter. They were attempting to package my return as a goodwill consultation, hoping the compensation would render the underlying IP question moot without their having to name it. Well, they're hoping to fold the IP issue into the day rate without acknowledging it directly, Josephine said. Yes. They won't succeed at that. No, I said. They won't. I thought for a moment. Tell them no to the current structure, I said. Counter with these terms. I gave her the counter. The counter had 4 points. The first was the day rate. I increased it by 40% over their offer, which placed it at a figure consistent with what specialist IP-bearing compliance consultants command in this market, which I had verified before the call. The second was a formal IP licensing agreement. Not a buyout, not a transfer of ownership, but a license. A structure under which Thornfield would pay an annual fee for the right to continue using the IRRP. And the fee had been calculated by Josephine and me from the firm's publicly available financial data and the internal documents I had retained legitimate copies of, applied to a standard IP valuation methodology for operational frameworks in the financial services sector. It was a number that would cause someone to stop and read it twice, but it was a number that was, by any defensible analysis, accurate. The third was a written acknowledgement from the board that my departure had constituted a constructive dismissal, not a voluntary resignation, not a mutual separation. The circumstances of my removal had altered the fundamental terms and conditions of my employment without my consent, which meets the applicable legal definition, and I wanted that named. It had implications for the separation terms I had signed, ousty terms which had been executed under a misrepresentation of the nature of my departure. The fourth was structural. I was not returning as an employee, I was returning as an independent consultant under a services contract between Thornfield and my own entity, Wren Advisory, which I had incorporated the previous week. Different legal standing, different protections, different tax treatment. I would not be working for Thornfield. Thornfield would be a client of mine. Josephine presented the counter on a Friday. By Friday afternoon, they had accepted points 1, 2, and 4. Point 3, the constructive dismissal acknowledgement, they pushed back on. We went back and forth through the weekend. On Monday morning, Josephine called with their revised position. They would not use the words constructive dismissal in any document. But they were willing to include a clause in the new contract, acknowledging that the circumstances of my departure did not reflect the firm's assessment of the quality of my professional work or the value of my contribution. And they were willing to include a one-time settlement payment that was, as Josephine observed with the kind of dryness that comes from having practiced this for 2 decades, functionally identical to what a constructive dismissal settlement would have been in this jurisdiction. Take it, I said. She took it. The papers were signed on a Wednesday morning. I read them twice at the kitchen table, in the house that still had my name and Dorian's on the deed, before I signed. The house was quiet in the way it was quiet now. Not the quiet of a shared space at an off hour, but the quiet of a space that had become singular again. Dorian had moved out in February to a rented apartment. The house itself remained a live matter, being addressed through attorneys. He had not expected me to keep it. He had assumed, I think, that I would want to leave, that the rooms would carry too much of what had happened in them. He had never understood how I felt about the things I built. I signed the papers. I put them in the folder alongside Clause 14.3b, the FCA letter, the IP filing, the time-stamped documentation, the accumulated record of one very long-term, very specific decision. Then I got up, got dressed, and drove to the Thornfield building for the first time since the morning I had carried 2 boxes to my car. The lobby guard looked up when I came through the revolving door. "Miss Mara," he said. "Good to see you." "Good morning," I said. The elevator smelled the same. The building smelled the same. Recycled air and carpet cleaner. That olfactory blankness that I had breathed every morning for 9 years. It registered now not as blankness, but as a specific familiar thing, the way a smell becomes specific once you have been away from it long enough. I took the elevator to the 4th floor. The open-plan desks were occupied. People looked up as I came past. Some looked away quickly, in the way people look away from things they have been quietly told not to address. Some held my gaze and nodded. I nodded back at each of them. Lavinia's desk was as it had been. The succulent was still there, a little larger now than it had been in January. 4 months. She was at her desk. She looked up as I passed, and something moved across her face in the brief, compressed way that complex feelings move across the faces of people who are working to contain them. Guilt was in there, and relief, and something that was not quite hostility, but was not warmth either. The look of someone who has spent 4 months understanding, incrementally, exactly what position they had been placed in. I didn't stop. I went to the conference room. Dorian was standing when I came in, looking at the window. When he heard the door, he turned, and there was the particular stilled quality of someone who had rehearsed an expression and found in the actual moment that it did not fit the way they had practiced. He looked older, not dramatically. A few months is not enough for that. But something in his posture was different. The specific weight that accumulates during a period of sustained professional anxiety, when things are not resolving the way you had represented to the relevant parties that they would resolve. He said my name. He held out his hand. I shook it, briefly. My hand was steady. "Thank you for coming in," he said. I sat down, opened my laptop, and took out my folder. "Let's start with the Q1 anomaly," I said. The other people in the room, a senior associate, and Carla, the external auditor, a woman in her late 40s who had been conducting FCA reviews for long enough that she had the measured, unreadable quality of someone who has heard every possible account of every possible error and has learned to wait, exchanged a glance that I did not acknowledge. Dorian sat down. We started with the Q1 anomaly. The work itself took 4 days. The Q1 reconciliation anomaly was exactly what I had understood it to be from the moment Gideon described it. A reserve calculation error produced by the unapplied September rollover adjustment carried consistently through all 3 months of the quarter. Consistent across all 3 months was what made it systemic, which was what had concerned the auditors most. A systemic error implies a framework problem. A framework problem, in an FCA review context, implies a full remediation process and a formal regulatory finding on the firm's record. I produced the documentation of the September adjustment from my personal files, time-stamped, annotated, complete. Carla, the external auditor, looked at it for a long time, with the particular silence of someone whose job requires her to be very certain before she says the next thing. "This was part of your working practice," she said. "Yes. And it wasn't in the formal procedure documentation." "No, I have provided a full account in the methodology document I've submitted." I indicated the pages in front of her. "The IR's reserve calculation has always required this adjustment. It is documented in my pre-departure working files with a timestamp of 11 days before my last day." She looked at the timestamp. She looked at me. She looked at the timestamp again. "The adjustment was applied correctly in all prior years," I said. "I can provide the full historical record." I provided the full historical record. By the end of day 2, the reserve calculations were restatement ready. By day 4, the auditors had what they needed to close the review without a formal regulatory finding. A clean closure was the outcome everyone needed, including me. A formal regulatory finding would have complicated the licensing arrangement, and the licensing arrangement was the actual point. Clean reviews benefit everyone. I had always believed this. I believed it still. The middle of day 2 produced something I had not anticipated. I was in the small meeting room off the main conference space, working alone through the historical reserve data, when Lavinia knocked and let herself in. She closed the door behind her and stood with her back against it for a moment, in the posture of someone who has decided something and is holding themselves to it. "I need to ask you something directly," she said. "All right. When you briefed me in January, the conversation about the reserve model, you gave me accurate information. It was not a question. It was something between a question and an accusation and a very specific kind of appeal. "Yes," I said. "You didn't leave anything out on purpose." The question was more sophisticated than I had expected. She was not accusing me of sabotage. She was asking me to confirm what she had already worked out, that the gap in her knowledge was the natural consequence of receiving a complex system in pieces, under time pressure, without asking the right questions before the clock ran out. She was asking me to tell her that the failure was navigational, not deliberate. "I answered what you asked me," I said. "You didn't put in the formal documentation request?" The silence that followed was specific and complete. "I should have," she said. "Oh, yes," I said. "You should have." She nodded. She looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who is integrating something they would have preferred not to need to integrate. Then she said quietly, "I didn't know the full scope of the role." "I know," I said. She left. I went back to the historical reserve data. At the end of day 4, when the auditors had packed their cases and said their careful, neutral goodbyes and the room had emptied, Dorian found me in the corridor outside the lifts. He had his hands in his pockets. He was standing in the specific way people stand when they have not planned what they are about to say. For 11 years, I had been able to read the difference between his prepared mode and his unguarded mode, and this was unmistakably the latter. "Mara," he said. I waited. I want you to know..." He stopped. He tried to begin again. "The way this was handled, the board meeting. I know how it must have looked." I said nothing. "I handled it badly," he said. I looked at him. The corridor was empty. The overhead light was the flat white of late-in-the-day office lighting, the kind that makes everyone look a little worn. "Yes," I said. "You did. I think we should talk, separately from the professional side of things. I'd like to..." "Dorian," I said. He stopped. "My attorney will contact yours about the property," I said. "Everything else is in the contract." I pressed the lift button. The doors opened. I stepped in. The doors closed. I did not look back, not as a performance, not to make a point. There was simply nothing behind me that required my attention. But the consulting contract ran for 6 months and was renewed twice. During the first renewal period, I trained a new compliance associate, not Lavinia, who had been moved to a client relations role that her actual skill set suited considerably better, and in which she was, by all accounts, performing well in the complete working practice of the IRRP the September rollover adjustment, the 6 judgment-based reserve parameters and their historical basis, the 3 annual cycle points where institutional knowledge was required and could not be replaced by formula, the 4 places in the Q4 reconciliation where the data entry sequence mattered as much as the data itself. I documented it all. The procedure manual I produced ran to 68 pages. Carla reviewed a section of it at the next annual FCA review and noted it in her report as exemplary documentation practice, representing a model of internal compliance transparency for firms of similar complexity and scale. I kept a copy of that report. I kept everything. The IP licensing fee arrived quarterly in the account of Wren Advisory, as specified in the contract. I had chosen the name carefully. A bird name, a small name, a name with no one else's history attached to it. No weight from anywhere I had already been. My own entity, my own client list, my own work, conducted on terms I had negotiated for myself. Within my professional network, it became known, in the careful, low-frequency way that professional information travels. So through introductions and footnotes, and the specific conversations people have when they are deciding whether to trust someone with a referral, that I had maintained and enforced IP rights over a compliance framework in an employment context. I received 2 calls from other professionals navigating similar situations. I directed both of them to Josephine. The property matter was resolved in May. I kept the house. Dorian had not expected this. He had assumed, I think, that I would want to leave, that the house would carry too much of what had happened inside it, that I would associate it with the version of my life that had ended. He did not understand how I felt about things I had built with sustained attention and long-term thought. He had never quite understood that, in the end. caboose the final board meeting I attended at Thornfield, the last one in my capacity as a consulting entity, at the end of the second renewal, was in October, 18 months after the January meeting at which Dorian had read from prepared remarks. While his board members studied the middle distance, the room was the same. The table was the same. 4 of the 7 board members were the same faces. I sat along the side wall, not at the table. Consultants don't sit at the board table. And I had written this into the contract. It was not a diminishment. It was a clarity. The board chair was a woman named Patricia who had joined in the spring. She had a background in regulatory law and a quality of attention, the kind that was obvious from the way she listened fully, and without preparing her next statement while you were still speaking, that I had come to appreciate from the first meeting. Patricia presented the year's compliance outcomes. Clean review, no regulatory findings, updated framework documentation, new associate trained and independently operational. She described the improvement in internal readiness metrics with the measured precision of someone who has read every document before the meeting and is now summarizing rather than discovering. Then she said that Thornfield wished to discuss the long-term terms of the IP licensing arrangement, as the firm was building a 5-year strategic growth plan and would benefit from a longer-term licensing structure. I had been preparing the proposal for 3 weeks. I presented it without preamble. A 5-year license, renewable, Audit with an annual rate indexed to a standard financial services benchmark. In exchange, Wren Advisory would provide 1 annual compliance review of the IRRP's current application, 1 day per year at a fixed day rate, 1 day per year. Patricia looked at the single page of the proposal for a moment. Then she looked at me. "This is clean," she said. "It's designed to be," I said. "We'll come back to you by end of week." "That works," I said. I closed my folder. They came back by Thursday. They accepted every term without revision. I signed the 5-year agreement from the home office, the room that had once been the guest bedroom and that I had converted, over the 18 months, into the workspace I'd always meant to have. My own shelving, my own reference library organized by the system that made sense to me. My own window that faced the garden in the afternoon and admitted the kind of quiet that allows sustained thinking. The IRRP ran, uninterrupted, inside a firm that now paid annually for the right to use what I had built. The licensing fee came in on schedule every quarter. Wren Advisory had 3 other client engagements by the end of the year, 2 of them referred through the professional network that had heard about the IP enforcement. Gideon called on a Sunday afternoon in November. He had been reading something in the financial press about a European regulatory change, the kind of thing that moves slowly through the system before arriving at domestic advisors 2 or 3 cycles later, and called because it reminded him of an argument we had had about market fragmentation years ago. That when he had been at the firm, and I had been too junior to disagree with him openly, and had disagreed with him precisely and clearly anyway. We talked for 40 minutes. At the end of the call, he said simply, "You did well, Mara." "The framework did well," I said. "The framework was you." "Yes," I said. "It was." After we hung up, I sat in my office for a moment. The afternoon light came through the window at the angle it always came at this hour. Low and direct and clean. On the desk was the folder. Clause 14.3b, the FCA letter, the IP filing documentation, the time-stamped records, the licensing agreement, the accumulated record of one very specific decision made very long ago by a woman who had paid attention at the table when it was easy not to. Oh, I had built something, and they had assumed that asking me to leave the room was the same thing as asking the building to leave with me. They had understood the building. They had not understood who drew the plans. You can be shown the door. That is a real thing that happens in real boardrooms at real tables to real people, by husbands with prepared statements and board members who study the wood grain. It happens all the time. It happened to me, but the door was theirs. The architecture was mine. I opened my laptop. The Wren Advisory inbox had a new client inquiry in it. A mid-size fixed-income advisory firm, a compliance director who had been referred by someone I had trained 3 years ago, writing to ask about a framework review. I started reading.